The leather portfolio rested against Marcus Bennett's knee as the elevator climbed toward the 20th floor of the Apex Technologies building. 3 years of rejection had taught him to memorize spaces before entering them. 14 steps from lobby door to security desk, left turn at the marble fountain, elevator bay with its distinct acoustic echo. His white cane tapped a rhythm against the polished floor, counting beats until the doors would open and he'd face the interview that could change everything. The accident replayed in fragments during quiet moments. Late winter 2024, the construction site in Queens where he'd worked as an IT safety engineer. The groan of metal, someone shouting a warning too late. Concrete and rebar crashing down in a shower of debris that turned his world into darkness punctuated by bursts of red. He'd woken in a hospital bed with Sarah's hand gripping his, her voice hoarse from crying as the doctor explained the damage. 15% vision remaining in his left eye, enough to distinguish light from shadow, vague shapes moving through fog. The right eye was gone, the optic nerve severed beyond repair. Sarah had been sick even then, though neither of them knew it. 6 months earlier, the cancer diagnosis had come during a routine checkup. Stage 3, the oncologist said, treatable but aggressive. She'd endured chemotherapy while Marcus recovered from surgery. Both of them trying to stay strong for Sophie, who was only 6 and didn't understand why Mommy was tired all the time and Daddy couldn't see her drawings anymore. The elevator chimed. Marcus stepped out, cane sweeping in an arc to locate the reception desk. A woman's voice, professional and clipped, directed him down the hallway to the boardroom. He'd arrived 30 minutes early, as he always did, to set up his equipment before anyone could witness the process. The specialized laptop with its braille display, the keyboard that clicked softly as his fingers found their positions, the discreet earpiece that would whisper stock prices and data points while executives droned about quarterly projections. Sarah had died in late 2023, 3 months before the accident. The cancer had spread faster than anyone predicted, metastasizing to her lungs and liver until the treatments became worse than the disease. Her last coherent words still echoed in moments of doubt. "Promise me you'll keep seeing with your heart." Marcus had held her hand and promised, though he didn't understand what she meant until Sophie, devastated and confused, had climbed into his hospital bed after the accident and whispered that she would be his eyes now. 23 job interviews across 8 months. Each rejection carried variations of the same message: liability concerns, incompatible systems, workplace safety regulations that couldn't accommodate his disability. Human resources managers spoke in careful euphemisms, their discomfort palpable even through phone calls. One recruiter had been blunt: "You're overqualified and under-equipped. Companies don't want the risk." The boardroom door stood open. Marcus entered, counting steps to locate the conference table, leather chairs, 20 of them arranged in a rectangle. He chose a seat midway down the left side, close enough to hear clearly but not presumptuous about positioning. The equipment came out piece by piece: laptop, keyboard, external battery pack. His fingers moved with practiced efficiency, assembling the tools that transformed his disability into a different kind of capability. Footsteps approached, multiple people filing in with the rustle of expensive suits and the click of designer heels. Marcus straightened, turning his head toward the sounds to establish eye contact even though he couldn't see faces. The meeting began with introductions he cataloged mentally, voices assigned to names and titles. Then came the presentation, a senior vice president droning about market penetration and consumer demographics, while Marcus's fingers flew across the braille keyboard. The system he'd developed with Sophie's help was faster than traditional note-taking. Audio processing software captured words and converted them to searchable text in real time. His braille display let him skim content as it appeared, organizing information by topic and speaker. Within minutes, he'd created a framework that most assistants would need hours to produce. Victoria Hartford's perfume reached him before her voice did. something floral with notes of sandalwood, expensive and understated. She'd positioned herself 2 seats away, close enough that he could sense her attention shifting toward him during pauses in the presentation. Her presence carried weight, the kind of authority that made others straighten unconsciously when she entered a room. The whisper came without warning, her breath warm against his ear as she leaned close. "Peek one more time and you're fired." The words were ice delivered with the casual cruelty of someone accustomed to intimidation. Marcus felt every conversation in the room halt, 20 executives turning to witness his humiliation. His first instinct was to explain. The adaptive technology, the accident, the whole tragic backstory that reduced him to an object of pity. But Sarah's voice echoed through his uncertainty. "You don't owe anyone your pain." The smile came naturally, unexpected even to himself. 3 years of facing greater challenges than an intimidating CEO had taught him the value of composure. He lifted his head toward Victoria's voice with the calm assurance of someone who had nothing left to prove to people blinded by their own assumptions. "I'm visually impaired, Ms. Hartford, trust me." The 2 words hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus heard Victoria's sharp intake of breath, felt the collective tension of 20 executives who suddenly realized they'd witnessed something unexpected. He'd just done what no one ever did to Victoria Hartford, called her bluff with unshakable composure. His fingers resumed their dance across the keyboard, the soft clicks filling the silence as conversation slowly, hesitantly resumed. The meeting continued for another 40 minutes. Marcus documented every word while his mind replayed the confrontation, analyzing Victoria's tone for signs of the termination he expected. When the room finally cleared, her voice stopped him as he reached for his cane. "Mr. Bennett, a word, please." He settled back into his chair with the same calm confidence that had carried him through 3 years of rebuilding his life from ruins. The door clicked shut. Victoria's footsteps circled the table, her presence stopping directly across from him. "I owe you an apology." The words weren't what Marcus had expected. In his experience, powerful people rarely acknowledged mistakes, especially to subordinates they'd just publicly humiliated. He kept his tone neutral, professional rather than accusatory. "Your assumption was understandable. Many people aren't familiar with adaptive workplace technology." "That's generous, but we both know I was out of line." Victoria's voice carried genuine regret beneath the formal tone. "Your personnel file mentioned visual impairment, but I hadn't taken time to understand what that meant practically. Most people don't. They hear visually impaired and assume either complete darkness or complete fabrication. Explain it to me." The request was direct, businesslike, but Marcus sensed genuine curiosity rather than administrative obligation. He opened his laptop, navigating through practiced finger movements across the screen. "I have approximately 15% vision remaining in my left eye, enough to distinguish light and shadow, some basic shapes and movement. My right eye was damaged beyond repair in the accident." "Construction accident." Victoria was clearly referencing his file. "You were an IT safety engineer, specializing in safety systems for construction firms. The irony doesn't escape me." Marcus kept his tone matter-of-fact, the way he'd learned to discuss the accident with Sophie when she asked questions. "The safety equipment prevented fatal injuries, but debris damaged my optic nerves. You have a daughter, Sophia, 9 years old." The shift from professional assessment to personal territory made Marcus's defenses rise. "What does my family have to do with my job?" "Everything." Victoria's response came without hesitation. "Your motivation is clear. I respect that." The acknowledgement caught him off guard. Most employers treated his single parenthood as another liability, another complication in an already complex situation. Victoria seemed to view it as strength. "Sophie's been my motivation for mastering these systems." Marcus gestured toward his equipment. "Hard to help with homework when you can't see traditional text. I learned audio-to-text conversion and braille displays quickly." She must be quite the teacher herself. She is. Marcus smiled slightly, thinking of Sophie's patient attempts to describe her art projects. She learned to describe things more vividly. I learned to listen more carefully. Sometimes limitations force you to discover capabilities you didn't know you had. The observation seemed to resonate with Victoria, though Marcus couldn't see her expression to confirm. Her chair creaked as she shifted, the sound suggesting she was leaning forward with interest rather than preparing to dismiss him. Your note-taking today was remarkably thorough, more detailed than most assistants manage. Marcus pulled up the document, his voice control software displaying it in large text that Victoria could read while audio provided him with the same information through his earpiece. Audio processing and voice-to-text conversion allows me to capture verbatim transcripts while simultaneously organizing key points by topic. I can have formatted meeting minutes ready for distribution within 20 minutes of adjournment, complete with action items and follow-up assignments. This is comprehensive. Victoria scanned the screen. You've organized statements by speaker, categorized decisions by department, and flagged items requiring follow-up. Most assistants take days to produce minutes this detailed. Efficiency was essential in my previous career. When you're managing information systems with multiple safety protocols, accurate documentation prevents costly mistakes. Marcus minimized the application. I applied the same principles to administrative work. Victoria's phone buzzed against the conference table, but she ignored it. Why administrative work? With your technical background, there must be IT positions better suited to your qualifications. The question touched territory Marcus usually avoided with employers, but something in Victoria's tone suggested genuine interest rather than invasive curiosity. Construction sites aren't accommodating to visual impairments. Safety regulations and insurance liability made returning to fieldwork impractical. Office-based IT positions required visual interface with multiple monitors and complex graphics that my adaptive technology couldn't fully access. So you chose administrative work. I chose work that would allow me to support my daughter while utilizing skills I could still perform effectively. Marcus corrected gently. Administrative work isn't a consolation prize. It's a strategic choice that matches my current capabilities with meaningful contribution. The phone buzzed again, more insistently. Victoria glanced at it with obvious reluctance. I need to take this. But Mr. Bennett, Marcus, I want to continue this conversation. Would you be available for lunch later this week? I'd like to better understand how to optimize your role here and ensure you have the resources needed for success. The invitation surprised him. Business lunches weren't typically extended to first-day administrative assistants, especially after public confrontations about their capabilities. Of course, I appreciate the opportunity. Good. Thursday, 12:30, Rossetti's on Fifth Avenue. Victoria's voice shifted, becoming almost warm. And Marcus, your work today was exemplary. I look forward to seeing what other assumptions you might challenge. Marcus remained seated after her footsteps receded, processing an interaction that had evolved far beyond his expectations. For the first time since his accident, he sensed that someone in authority saw his adaptations as strengths rather than accommodations, his different approach as valuable rather than problematic. The apartment Marcus shared with Sophie was modest but meticulously organized. Every item had its precise location, creating a system of textured labels and strategic placement that transformed their home into a space where his disability rarely felt limiting. Kitchen cabinets contained dishes grouped by function, refrigerator shelves divided into zones Sophie had helped designate, living room furniture positioned to create clear pathways. Sophie's voice carried from the dining table where she completed homework. Dad, Mrs. Anderson was watching us again this morning when you walked me to the bus stop. She had that worried face she always makes when you use your cane. Marcus stirred pasta sauce at the stove, navigating by memory and the subtle sounds of Sophie shifting in her chair. Mrs. Anderson, their well-meaning but intrusive neighbor, had appointed herself unofficial guardian of their welfare, her constant offers of help thinly disguising her belief that a visually impaired single father couldn't possibly manage childcare adequately. "Mrs. Anderson means well, sweetheart. She just doesn't understand that we have our own systems. I tried to tell her you're the best dad ever and that you can do everything other dads do, just differently. But she made that smile adults do when they think kids don't know anything." Marcus chuckled, recognizing Sophie's perfect description of the condescending expression he could no longer see but remembered well. "Some people need time to adjust their expectations. Remember how your art teacher was surprised when she saw how we worked on your projects together? And now she says our way is better because we focus more on textures and feelings instead of just how things look." Sophie's pride was evident. "That's what I mean about your heart seeing more than other people's eyes." The simple profundity of her observation struck Marcus deeply. He brought their plates to the table, navigating by memory and the subtle sounds of Sophie's movements. Moments like these reminded him how much Sophie's perspective had been shaped by their shared challenges. While he sometimes worried about the burden his disability placed on her childhood, she seemed to have developed wisdom and empathy beyond her years. "How was your first day?" Sophie asked between bites. Marcus hesitated, unsure how much to share about the boardroom confrontation. "Interesting. The CEO accused me of faking my disability, then apologized and invited me to lunch to discuss expanding my role." "She sounds intense." Sophie's tone carried neither judgment nor concern, just observation. "She is. Very successful, very focused. Reminds me a bit of your mother, actually. That same determination to excel." The comparison came unexpectedly, surprising them both. Marcus rarely mentioned Sarah around Sophie, worried that keeping her mother's memory alive might prevent his daughter from moving forward. But Sophie's response was thoughtful rather than sad. "Mom would like that you found someone who sees your brain instead of your eyes." "We're talking about a professional relationship, Soph. My boss, not—" "I know, Dad." Sophie's voice carried the gentle patience of a child accustomed to managing her father's emotional evasions. "But she invited you to lunch. That's more than just work stuff." Marcus couldn't argue with her logic. The invitation did feel personal, crossing boundaries that most executives maintained carefully. But admitting that meant acknowledging his own unexpected interest in Victoria Hartford, something he wasn't ready to examine. Thursday arrived with Marcus arriving 15 minutes early at Rossetti's, a upscale Italian restaurant that occupied a historic brownstone on Fifth Avenue. The maitre d' guided him to a corner table where Victoria was already seated, her greeting warmer than her office persona. "You're precisely on time. Punctuality is underappreciated these days." "A habit developed during my job search." Marcus settled into his chair, subtly exploring the table settings with his fingertips. "Arriving early gives me time to orient myself in new environments. I took the liberty of requesting menus in both Braille and standard print. They're preparing one now." The consideration surprised him. Most people didn't think about such details until prompted. "Thank you. That's thoughtful." "It's practical. Efficiency requires addressing obvious needs directly rather than pretending they don't exist." The waiter arrived with menus, including one with Braille overlay that allowed Marcus to review options independently. After they ordered, Victoria shifted the conversation from pleasantries to purpose with characteristic directness. "Your summary of the Nexus project was remarkably insightful. You identified integration challenges our development team has been downplaying for months." Her tone conveyed genuine appreciation. "Most importantly, you presented problems alongside potential solutions rather than simply highlighting obstacles. That approach was standard in my previous role." Safety systems require identifying failure points before they become critical. Marcus took a sip of water. The timeline concerns me most. The architecture is sound, but the implementation schedule doesn't account for integration testing across different platforms. Exactly my assessment, though the project leads insist otherwise. Victoria seemed pleased by their aligned thinking. This is precisely why I wanted to discuss expanding your role. Your technical background combined with your documentation skills creates a valuable perspective most executives lack. I'm interested, but I should be transparent about my limitations. Complex visual interfaces remain challenging even with my adaptive technology. Certain aspects of project management would require modifications to standard workflows. Modifications that might benefit everyone, not just you. Victoria's response came without hesitation. I've been reviewing research on adaptive workplace technologies. Many of the tools you use could improve efficiency for all employees, regardless of ability status. The conversation paused as their food arrived. Marcus navigated his plate with practiced movements, having developed techniques that allowed him to dine independently without drawing attention. He noticed Victoria didn't fill conversational space with unnecessary talk, another consideration that made the interaction more comfortable. May I ask what prompted your interest in adaptive technologies? Marcus kept his tone curious rather than challenging. Most executives don't personally involve themselves in accommodation details. 3 factors. Victoria's voice shifted almost imperceptibly, becoming more personal. First, practical business interest. Inefficient processes waste resources regardless of why they exist. Second, competitive advantage. Diverse perspectives lead to better innovation. Third, personal experience. My younger brother has dyslexia. I watched him struggle with educational systems designed for neurotypical students, then excel when given appropriate tools. The disclosure was unexpected from someone with Victoria's carefully maintained professional persona. That experience shapes perspectives in ways theoretical knowledge can't. Precisely. Which brings me to my proposal. Victoria's voice returned to businesslike efficiency. I want to create a new position, technical documentation specialist, reporting directly to me. You would review project specifications, translate technical requirements into executive summaries, and identify potential integration challenges before they become critical failures. The opportunity aligned perfectly with Marcus's skills while accommodating his disability. That sounds ideal, but wouldn't creating a new position raise questions? I've already noticed some concern about your interest in my work. Office politics. Victoria dismissed the issue with audible disdain. Richard Montgomery and Patricia Daniels believe I'm letting personal factors influence business decisions. They're partially correct. I personally value efficiency and competence, which influence every business decision I make. And the fact that you're creating a position for someone with a disability doesn't concern you from a perception standpoint? I'm creating a position that leverages specific skills to address an existing business need. Your disability is relevant only insofar as it contributed to the development of those skills. Victoria's voice carried absolute conviction. Anyone who sees it differently is revealing their own biases, not mine. The statement resonated with Marcus's own philosophy about his condition. I don't view these adaptations as limitations, but as different skills, like learning another language. Exactly. Different tools for different needs. Victoria seemed to appreciate the analogy. Now there's something else I wanted to discuss. Your daughter, Sophia. You mentioned she's 9. The shift in topic surprised Marcus. Yes, 4th grade, extremely bright, especially in science. You're raising her alone since your wife passed away. The question approached personal territory Marcus rarely discussed with colleagues, but Victoria's tone conveyed genuine interest rather than invasive curiosity. Yes, Sarah died of cancer when Sophie was 6, about 6 months before my accident. We were dealing with both her illness and the aftermath of my injury simultaneously. That must have been incredibly difficult. It was. Marcus's voice softened with memory. Sarah was worried about leaving Sophie with a father who was still learning to navigate his own limitations. She spent her last months teaching me things she'd always handled. Braiding hair, explaining girl drama, talking through emotions I wasn't equipped to understand. Victoria listened with complete attention, her usual multitasking apparently set aside. How do you balance caregiving with your own healing process? The question demonstrated insight Marcus hadn't expected. Most people focused on practical logistics, childcare, finances, daily routines. Victoria was asking about emotional sustainability. Some days better than others. Sophie's resilience helps. She accepted changes as they came rather than mourning what was lost. Her attitude taught me to focus on what we were building together rather than what we'd left behind. She sounds remarkable. She is. She's participating in the district science fair next month with a model of Jupiter she designed with both visual and tactile elements, so we could work on it together. Marcus found himself sharing details he wouldn't normally discuss professionally. She wants us to present it together to demonstrate how different perspectives can create something better than either could alone. That's an insightful approach for a 9-year-old. I'd like to meet her sometime. The statement seemed to surprise Victoria herself, who quickly added, if that wouldn't be inappropriate, of course. Marcus weighed the invitation carefully. Introducing Sophie to his boss crossed professional boundaries, but Victoria's interest felt genuine rather than calculated. Sophie would love that. She's been asking when she gets to meet the important people from Dad's work. Important people. Victoria's tone carried subtle amusement. She'd probably quiz me about my job and offer suggestions for improving business operations. Almost certainly. She has strong opinions about efficiency and fairness. Then I'd welcome her perspective. Children often see solutions adults miss because they're not constrained by assumptions about how things should work. The remainder of lunch focused on practical details, reporting structure, compensation, performance metrics for the proposed position. As they prepared to leave, Victoria's voice took on an unusual note of uncertainty. Marcus, would you and Sophie like to join me for dinner this weekend? Somewhere family-friendly, obviously. I realize it's unconventional for a CEO to socialize with employees outside work events. But I genuinely enjoy our conversations and would like to continue them in a more relaxed setting. The invitation crossed professional boundaries Marcus had never expected anyone in leadership to traverse. Victoria's tone suggested personal interest rather than corporate obligation, genuine curiosity about his life rather than strategic relationship building. Sophie would love that, and so would I. Perfect. I'll have my assistant coordinate details with you. Walking back to the Apex building, Marcus realized his initial assessment of Victoria Hartford had been as incomplete as her assumptions about his capabilities. Behind the formidable CEO was someone capable of genuine curiosity, personal growth, and apparently friendship that transcended corporate hierarchies. For the first time since returning to work, he felt like he'd found not just employment but connection with someone who saw his adaptations as strengths rather than limitations. That evening, Sophie greeted the news of Victoria's dinner invitation with unconcealed excitement. She spent the next 2 days planning questions about business operations and technology development, approaching the dinner with the same strategic thinking she applied to her science projects. Marcus watched his daughter prepare and felt both pride and trepidation. Sophie was investing emotionally in this relationship with his boss, building expectations that could shatter if Victoria's interest proved temporary. Friday evening found them at Bruno's Family Pizzeria, a casual restaurant Sophie had chosen for its famous dessert menu. Marcus and Sophie arrived first, both dressed in their best casual clothes, both trying to hide their nervousness. Victoria appeared 10 minutes later wearing jeans and a soft sweater, the first time Marcus had seen her in anything but business attire. The transformation was striking even to his limited vision. Her presence felt softer, more accessible. Sophie's greeting was characteristically direct. "Ms. Hartford, it's nice to meet you. Dad says you're the boss of his whole building. That must be really hard work. Do you get to make all the decisions?" Victoria's laugh was genuine, the sound free from the calculated politeness Marcus had heard in professional settings. "Most of them. But the best bosses listen to smart people before making important choices. Your father gives excellent advice." Sophie beamed with pride as they settled into the booth. "He's really smart. He taught me that being different doesn't mean being less good at things. It just means you do things in your own special way." The simple wisdom, delivered with 9-year-old certainty, seemed to resonate with Victoria more deeply than Marcus had expected. Throughout dinner, she listened to Sophie's enthusiastic explanation of the Jupiter model with complete attention, asking questions that revealed genuine interest rather than adult condescension. "So you both contributed different skills based on your different ways of seeing," Victoria summarized when Sophie paused for breath. "That's actually an excellent model for effective teamwork in any context." "That's what my teacher said." Sophie's excitement was palpable. "She wants us to present it together at the science fair to show how different perspectives make better projects. Do you have people with different perspectives on your teams at work?" The sophisticated inquiry surprised Marcus, though Sophie had grown up discussing workplace dynamics with him, absorbing concepts about diversity and inclusion that most adults barely comprehended. Victoria seemed momentarily startled by the question coming from a child. "Not as many as we should. That's something I'm working to change." The conversation flowed naturally throughout dinner, Victoria gradually shedding the polished corporate persona Marcus had assumed was her only mode. She answered Sophie's questions about running a technology company with thoughtful consideration, explaining complex concepts in accessible terms without condescension. By the time they were sharing dessert, a massive ice cream sundae Sophie had insisted they needed to experience, the atmosphere felt remarkably comfortable. As they prepared to leave, Victoria surprised them both with an unexpected invitation. "There's a technology exhibit at the National Science Museum next weekend, focused on accessibility innovations. Would you both be interested in going? They're showcasing some remarkable advances in adaptive technologies." Sophie's enthusiasm was immediate and vocal, but Marcus hesitated briefly, aware of the potential complications. Professional boundaries were blurring into something more personal, and while part of him welcomed the connection, another part feared the inevitable complications. "That sounds wonderful if you're sure it wouldn't be imposing on your weekend." "Not at all. I've been meaning to see the exhibit, and experiencing it with someone who uses adaptive technology daily would be particularly valuable." They confirmed details, and as Victoria's car pulled away from the curb, Sophie slipped her hand into Marcus's with a satisfied sigh. "I like her, Dad. She doesn't talk to me like I'm a baby, and she looks at you like she sees the real you, not just your eyes." The observation, delivered with a child's unfiltered honesty, lingered in Marcus's thoughts long after Sophie had fallen asleep. Victoria Hartford was becoming something he hadn't anticipated when accepting the position at Apex Technologies. Not just an employer or even an ally, but possibly a friend. The implications of that shift, both personally and professionally, were complex and potentially fraught with complications. But for the first time in 3 years, Marcus allowed himself to consider the possibility of connection beyond survival. Monday morning arrived with the weight of unspoken scrutiny. Marcus stepped off the elevator at Apex Technologies to find the usual morning chatter dying into pointed shunts. Eyes tracked his movement toward his desk, conversations resuming at conspicuously lower volumes. He'd experienced this before, the uncomfortable awareness that became his presence whenever workplace dynamics shifted unpredictably. Jason Reynolds leaned against the coffee station with 2 colleagues, their posture and sudden quiet making clear they'd been discussing him. Marcus navigated past them without acknowledgement, but Jason's voice carried just loud enough to be heard. 3-hour lunch with the CEO on day 3. Weekend plans by Friday. Must be nice getting special treatment. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Marcus stopped, turning toward the voice with deliberate calm. His limited vision caught Jason's outline, tall and angular against the break room's fluorescent lighting. "You have something to say to my face, Jason?" The challenge shifted the energy immediately. Jason straightened, clearly not expecting direct confrontation. His voice dropped to something approximating professional courtesy. "Just making an observation about rapid advancement, no offense intended. Then perhaps observe more carefully before drawing conclusions." Marcus kept his tone level, refusing to give Jason the reaction he wanted. "My work speaks for itself." He continued to his desk, aware that the exchange had only fueled speculation rather than quelling it. David Parker appeared minutes later, settling into the adjacent workspace with a coffee mug that clinked deliberately against the desk surface, his usual signal that he wanted Marcus's attention. "Heads up. Patricia Daniels scheduled an accommodation review meeting for 10 o'clock. She's been asking questions about your equipment setup and reporting structure." Marcus's stomach tightened. Accommodation reviews were typically routine, but the timing suggested something more adversarial. "Any idea what triggered it?" "Someone saw you and Victoria at Rossetti's. Then there's the dinner Friday night with your daughter." David's voice carried sympathy rather than judgment. "In a company this size, nothing stays private for long." "We were discussing a potential position expansion. The dinner was Victoria's idea to meet Sophie, given my family situation." Even as Marcus spoke the words, he recognized how they might sound to someone predisposed toward suspicion. "I believe you. But Patricia's old school about professional boundaries, and she's been looking for ways to check Victoria's authority since the last board shakeup." David stood, coffee mug scraping against wood. "Just be prepared for uncomfortable questions." The morning crawled toward 10 o'clock. Marcus prepared his responses, anticipating the careful language HR directors use to question situations without making actionable accusations. When Patricia's assistant summoned him to the small conference room on the 14th floor, he gathered his cane and tablet with the resigned calm of someone who'd defended his competence too many times to count. Patricia sat behind a laptop, her fingers clicking against keys as Marcus entered. She gestured toward a chair across from her without looking up, the gesture itself a subtle power play. Marcus settled in and waited, refusing to speak first. "Mr. Bennett, I want to be clear, this meeting is standard procedure for all employees with accommodation needs." Patricia's voice carried practiced neutrality. "We're committed to ensuring you have everything necessary to perform your role effectively." The preamble was deliberate, establishing the meeting's official purpose before introducing the real agenda. Marcus simply nodded, conserving his energy for whatever came next. However, the incident in last week's executive meeting raises some concerns about communication protocols. Patricia finally looked up from her screen. "Additionally, certain behaviors have come to our attention that suggest potential boundary issues." By incident, I assume you're referring to Ms. Hartford's misunderstanding about my adaptive technology, which she promptly apologized for and corrected. Marcus kept his response factual rather than defensive. "Yes, that situation was resolved appropriately, but we've noticed an unusual level of personal involvement developing between you and Ms. Hartford. Attendance at business lunches, proposed position changes, social activities outside work hours." Patricia leaned back, her chair creaking. "Such involvement inevitably creates perception issues regarding objectivity and fair treatment." There it was, the accusation wrapped in corporate concern. Marcus felt the familiar anger rising, the same frustration he'd battled through 23 job rejections. He forced it down, channeling it into clarity rather than heat. Are you questioning my qualifications for the proposed position or suggesting that Ms. Hartford's professional judgment is compromised by personal factors? Patricia's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. We're noting that rapid advancement and personal attention from a CEO toward a new employee with your particular circumstances creates optics that could be problematic. My particular circumstances. Marcus let the phrase hang between them. You mean my disability, or perhaps you're referring to something else. The implication was deliberate, forcing Patricia to either clarify her concern or retreat from the conversation's subtext. She chose deflection. Your disability requires certain accommodations which we're happy to provide. However, the appearance of favoritism, regardless of the reason, can undermine team morale and raise questions about merit-based advancement. Then perhaps we should discuss merit. Marcus opened his tablet, navigating to the files he'd prepared. Since starting at Apex, I've produced comprehensive meeting documentation that reduced follow-up questions by 63%. I identified 3 critical integration issues in the Nexus project that the development team missed. My technical assessments have been cited in 2 executive briefings. His voice remained level, each word measured. These are objective outcomes. If someone questions whether I earned consideration for advancement based on performance, that reveals their biases, not mine. Patricia's jaw tightened. Before she could respond, the conference room door opened without warning. David Parker entered carrying a folder, his expression apologetic but determined. Patricia, sorry to interrupt. I was told you wanted to see me about Marcus's position. Patricia's surprise was evident in the slight pause before she responded. This is a private accommodation review, David. I'll speak with you afterward. Actually, given that the proposed position interfaces significantly with IT operations, my input seems relevant to any organizational discussion. David settled into a chair beside Marcus, his presence a clear statement of alliance. I reviewed Marcus's technical assessments last week. Frankly, they're the most insightful analysis I've seen from someone outside the engineering team. This meeting isn't about technical competence, Patricia began, but David continued as though she hadn't spoken. I have a nephew, Josh, who's deaf, works as a sound engineer in Los Angeles, won multiple awards for his work. He uses specialized equipment that lets him see sound patterns most people can't detect. David opened his folder, revealing what appeared to be performance metrics. Josh taught me that different doesn't mean less capable. Usually means more capable in ways others haven't learned to recognize. The parallel was obvious, deliberate. Patricia's lips pressed into a thin line. Mr. Parker, while I appreciate your perspective, HR decisions about reporting structure and accommodation protocols fall under operational purview when they impact workflow efficiency. David slid the folder across the table toward Patricia. These are productivity metrics for Marcus's department since he started. Communication delays down 42%, documentation accuracy up 57%, cross-departmental coordination improved measurably. He tapped the top page. If you're questioning whether Victoria's organizational decisions are sound, the data supports them completely. Patricia's expression shifted from administrative authority to frustrated recognition that her concerns were being systematically dismantled. She closed her laptop with deliberate precision. I see that both you and Ms. Hartford feel strongly about Mr. Bennett's placement. We'll maintain the existing arrangement for now, but I want to be clear that any appearance of impropriety will be addressed immediately. The threat was thinly veiled. Marcus stood, gathering his belongings with practiced efficiency. I appreciate your diligence in ensuring appropriate workplace standards, Ms. Daniels. If there's nothing else... Patricia dismissed them with a curt nod. In the hallway, David walked beside Marcus toward the elevators, his voice dropping to just above a whisper. Richard Montgomery called an emergency board meeting for next Monday. Topic listed as organizational changes requiring board review. He's going after Victoria through me. Marcus stopped walking, processing the implications. questioning her judgment, her decision-making. Probably. Richard's been looking for leverage since Victoria took the CEO position 3 years ago. He sees your rapid integration into her inner circle as evidence of compromised leadership. David pressed the elevator call button. Just thought you should know what's coming. Saturday arrived with Sophie vibrating with barely contained excitement. She'd spent the previous evening preparing questions for Victoria about emerging technologies and accessibility innovations, approaching the museum visit with the same intensity she brought to her Jupiter project. Marcus dressed carefully, aware that this outing blurred professional and personal boundaries in ways he hadn't fully examined. Victoria met them at the museum's main entrance, her casual attire, dark jeans and a burgundy sweater, somehow making her seem more approachable than her boardroom persona. Sophie rushed forward with a greeting that bypassed all adult formality. "Ms. Hartford, Dad said the exhibit has technology that can translate images into sound. Is that really possible?" Victoria's smile was genuine, unguarded in a way Marcus hadn't witnessed before. "It is, and please call me Victoria, Miss. Hartford makes me feel like I'm still at work." They moved through the exhibit hall together, Sophie providing running narration for Marcus while Victoria added context about the technologies on display. The adaptive tech section showcased innovations ranging from haptic feedback systems to AI-powered navigation aids. Marcus found himself demonstrating his screen reader for a small crowd that gathered, explaining how the technology translated visual information into audio cues he could process. A teacher in the group raised her hand tentatively. "How do you manage daily life? The cooking, the childcare, everything people assume requires sight." The question was familiar, asked with genuine curiosity rather than skepticism. Marcus pulled out his phone, activating its accessibility features. Modern systems combine text-to-speech with haptic feedback and spatial audio. For cooking, I use talking measuring cups and timers. For childcare, Sophie and I developed communication systems that work for both of us. He gestured toward his daughter. "She describes visual details I need. I handle everything else parents handle. Homework help, bedtime stories, emotional support, different tools, same outcomes." An older man in the crowd leaned forward, his voice carrying skepticism Marcus had learned to recognize immediately. "But surely there are limitations, things you simply can't do without assistance." Marcus felt Sophie tense beside him, her hand gripping his arm protectively. He squeezed her fingers gently, signaling he could handle this himself. "There are tasks that require adaptation, but limitations exist for everyone. We all have capabilities we lack and tools we use to compensate. My adaptations are just more visible than most people's." Victoria's voice cut through before the man could respond. "I find that different perspectives often identify solutions others miss because they're not constrained by assumptions about how things should work." Marcus has already identified several operational inefficiencies at Apex that our fully sighted executives overlooked for months. The subtle edge in her tone carried both defense and challenge. The crowd dispersed shortly after, but the teacher approached Marcus with a business card. "I work with visually impaired students. Would you be willing to speak to our class sometime? They need to see successful adults living full lives." Marcus pocketed the card, moved by the implication that his life could serve as inspiration rather than cautionary tale. Sophie tugged his hand toward the planetarium, where a special presentation on Jupiter's atmospheric dynamics was starting in 20 minutes. They found seats in the dome's center section, Sophie positioning herself between Marcus and Victoria with obvious strategic intent. The lights dimmed. The narrator's voice filled the space, describing Jupiter's swirling cloud bands and massive storms, while high-definition imagery transformed the dome into a close-up view of the gas giant. Sophie whispered details the narrator omitted, her small hand resting on Marcus's arm as she connected auditory information to visual spectacle. On his other side, Victoria sat close enough that he could sense her warmth, hear her breathing, feel the subtle shift when she leaned slightly toward him. In the darkened planetarium, surrounded by strangers lost in cosmic imagery, Marcus experienced something unexpected, not accommodation but inclusion. Sophie's whispered descriptions and Victoria's attentive presence combined with his own sensory awareness to create an experience as rich and meaningful as any sighted person's. For the first time since his accident, he felt not like someone being helped, but like someone simply participating. When the presentation ended and they emerged into afternoon sunlight, Sophie bounced with excitement about the great red spot's shrinking diameter. Victoria suggested lunch at a small cafe near the museum, and they settled into a corner booth where Sophie monopolized conversation with enthusiastic explanations of her Jupiter model's tactile features. Victoria listened with complete attention, asking questions that demonstrated genuine interest rather than adult indulgence. So the different textures represent different atmospheric layers? That's ingenious. Most models focus only on visual accuracy. Dad helped me think about how to make it educational for people who learn differently. Sophie's pride in their collaboration was palpable. We want everyone to understand Jupiter, not just people who can see it. That's a valuable philosophy for any kind of design. Victoria's gaze shifted to Marcus. Different ways of experiencing information shouldn't mean unequal access to knowledge. The observation carried weight beyond its immediate context, touching on the broader philosophy that had governed Marcus's adaptation to disability. As they finished lunch, Sophie excused herself to the restroom, leaving Marcus and Victoria alone for the first time that day. Victoria's voice dropped to something more private. Thank you for including me today. I haven't felt this relaxed in months, maybe years. Sophie's been excited all week. She doesn't get many opportunities to share her interests with adults who take her seriously. I meant thank you for including me in your lives. Victoria's correction was gentle but significant. Watching how you and Sophie navigate the world together, the systems you've built, the trust between you, it's remarkable and humbling. Marcus felt the conversation shifting into territory that made his chest tighten with equal parts anticipation and fear. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed with an incoming text. He activated the screen reader, Victoria falling silent as the mechanical voice read the message aloud. Dad, mean lady at school says you don't belong there. Brandon's mom is trying to get you banned from campus. I'm scared. Can you come Monday? Sophie. The message was jarring in its directness, so unlike Sophie's usual careful phrasing. Marcus's confusion lasted only seconds before Sophie returned to the table, her expression carefully neutral. Too neutral for a 9-year-old who'd just sent such a message. Sophie, did you just text me from the bathroom? Her eyes widened slightly, caught. I wanted to tell you about Monday. There's a parent-teacher thing. I was going to mention it, but then I thought maybe... Her gaze slid to Victoria, and everything clicked into place. Sophie Bennett, did you message me hoping Victoria would see it? Sophie's chin lifted with defiant honesty. Mrs. Wilson has been saying mean things about you at PTA meetings. Ms. Rodriguez told me, and I thought maybe Victoria could help because she's important and people listen to important people. The strategic thinking behind the manipulation was simultaneously impressive and concerning. Marcus felt Victoria's hand touch his arm lightly, her voice careful. What's happening at school, Sophie? Sophie's composure cracked, tears welling as the story spilled out. Brandon Wilson had been escalating his bullying since the school year started, calling Marcus a blind freak and telling other kids that Sophie's dad was too disabled to be a real parent. When Sophie defended Marcus, Brandon's mother, Karen, had complained to the principal about Sophie's aggressive behavior. Monday's conference was supposed to address the ongoing conflict. Marcus's anger was cold and focused. Why didn't you tell me about this before? Because you already have people at work being mean about you being blind. I didn't want you to worry about school, too. Sophie's voice broke. But Mrs. Wilson told Principal Davis that you shouldn't be allowed at school events because you're a safety concern. She wants you banned from campus. Victoria's posture shifted, her body language transforming from relaxed to combat-ready. What time is the meeting Monday? 3 o'clock, but Victoria, you don't need to, Marcus began. What time, Sophie? 3:15. Sophie's tears had stopped, replaced by cautious hope. I'll be there. Victoria's tone carried absolute certainty. As a family friend concerned about educational accessibility and inclusion policies. Marcus wanted to argue, to insist he could handle this himself, but the truth was that Karen Wilson represented exactly the kind of institutional prejudice that had defeated him repeatedly. People like her wrapped discrimination in concern for children's welfare, making it nearly impossible to challenge without appearing defensive or aggressive. Having Victoria's corporate authority in the room might shift dynamics enough to protect Sophie. Thank you. The words felt inadequate for what Victoria was offering, but she seemed to understand their weight. Sunday passed in tense preparation. Marcus reviewed his rights as a parent with disabilities, prepared documentation of his caregiving capabilities, and rehearsed responses to the accusations he anticipated. Sophie remained subdued, her usual chatter replaced by anxious swints that broke Marcus's heart. Monday afternoon arrived too quickly. Marcus walked Sophie to school early, navigating the familiar route to Lincoln Elementary with practiced confidence. Ms. Rodriguez met them at the classroom, her expression sympathetic and frustrated in equal measure. Mr. Bennett, I want you to know this meeting was Mrs. Wilson's demand, not mine. Sophie's been an exemplary student, and her defense of you was entirely appropriate given Brandon's behavior. I appreciate that, Ms. Rodriguez. We'll get through this. Principal Davis's office was cramped, made smaller by the tension radiating from Karen Wilson, who sat rigidly in one of the visitor chairs. The principal, a tired-looking man in his 50s, gestured Marcus toward the remaining seat with visible reluctance to begin what promised to be an uncomfortable confrontation. Karen spoke before anyone else could establish the meeting's parameters. Principal Davis, I appreciate you arranging this. As I've explained, my son Brandon has been subjected to aggressive behavior from Sophia Bennett, and I believe the root cause is Mr. Bennett's inability to provide appropriate supervision and guidance due to his condition. The pause before condition was deliberate, loaded with implications Karen clearly wanted to avoid stating directly. Marcus kept his voice level, refusing to match her hostility. Ms. Wilson, if we're discussing aggressive behavior, perhaps we should address your son calling me a blind freak in front of multiple students. Or telling Sophie that disabled people shouldn't be allowed to have children. Karen's face flushed. Children repeat things without understanding their impact. Brandon was simply expressing concerns he's heard from other parents about whether someone with your limitations can safely participate in school activities. Other parents. Marcus leaned forward slightly. Or specifically you. I'm speaking as a concerned member of the PTA board about legitimate safety issues. Your inability to supervise children during field trips, your potential to create hazards in crowded school environments. These aren't discriminatory concerns, they're practical realities. Principal Davis cleared his throat uncomfortably. Mrs. Wilson has suggested that perhaps limiting Mr. Bennett's on-campus presence might reduce tensions and allow the children to focus on education rather than accommodation issues. The carefully neutral phrasing didn't disguise the recommendation's core. Ban the disabled parent to avoid discomfort. Marcus felt his carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. Years of accumulated frustration with exactly this kind of institutionalized discrimination threatening to explode. The office door opened without warning. Victoria stepped inside wearing a crisp business suit, her presence transforming the room's energy immediately. I apologize for the interruption. I'm Victoria Hartford, family friend of the Bennetts. Sophie mentioned today's meeting, and I wanted to coordinate scheduling for her upcoming science fair presentation. Principal Davis stood reflexively, recognition crossing his features. Ms. Hartford, we weren't expecting. This is actually a parent-teacher conference about a disciplinary matter. I see. In that case, I'll wait outside. Victoria moved toward the door, then paused as though something had just occurred to her. Although, since I'm here, perhaps I should mention that Apex Technologies has been reviewing educational partnerships for our community investment program. We're particularly interested in schools demonstrating strong commitment to inclusive education and disability rights. Karen Wilson's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, her aggressive stance softening as she processed the implications of Victoria's presence and casual mention of corporate funding. Victoria continued as though simply making conversation. Schools that actively work to remove barriers for students and families with disabilities make excellent partners for our accessibility initiatives. Conversely, institutions with patterns of exclusionary behavior toward disabled parents wouldn't align with our corporate values. The message was clear without being explicitly threatening. Principal Davis sat up straighter, his tired expression sharpening into calculation. Ms. Hartford, I want to assure you that Lincoln Elementary takes inclusion very seriously. This meeting is simply to address a conflict between students and ensure all parties feel heard. I'm glad to hear it. Educational environments should welcome diverse families, not create barriers based on disability. Victoria's gaze shifted to Karen Wilson. I assume everyone involved shares that commitment to inclusion? Karen's face had gone pale, then flushed deep red as she recognized the trap closing around her position. Of course, I think there's been a misunderstanding. My concern was never about Mr. Bennett's presence, just about ensuring appropriate support systems are in place for all parents. The backpedaling was clumsy but decisive. Principal Davis seized the opportunity to reframe the entire meeting. Perhaps we should focus on how the school can better support both children in resolving their conflict constructively. Mrs. Wilson, would Brandon benefit from additional education about disability awareness and respectful communication? Yes, that seems appropriate. Karen's voice had lost all its earlier aggression. And I apologize if my concerns came across as discriminatory. That certainly wasn't my intent. The apology was forced, extracted by social pressure rather than genuine recognition of wrongdoing, but Marcus accepted it with a curt nod. The meeting concluded quickly after that, with Principal Davis promising comprehensive diversity training for all students and a clear directive that Sophie's defense of her father had been appropriate given Brandon's bullying behavior. In the parking lot afterward, Marcus turned to Victoria with emotions he couldn't fully articulate. Gratitude, relief, and underneath it all, a troubling awareness of his own vulnerability. You didn't have to do that. Sophie texted me, remember? Victoria's voice was gentle. She asked for help. I couldn't ignore that. She manipulated both of us with that text, played on my protective instincts and your... Marcus trailed off, unsure how to finish the sentence. My what? Victoria stepped closer, her voice dropping. My care for both of you? She didn't manipulate that, Marcus. It's real. The admission hung between them, more significant than the victory they'd just achieved inside. Marcus felt the walls he'd maintained since Sarah's death beginning to crumble, replaced by something terrifying in its vulnerability. I've been handling things alone for so long. His voice came out rougher than intended. Accepting help feels like admitting I can't protect my own daughter. Feels like admitting you don't have to do everything alone anymore. Victoria's hand found his, her fingers interlacing with his in a gesture that felt simultaneously natural and monumental. Let people help you, Marcus. It doesn't make you weak, it makes you human. The truth in her words cut through defenses he'd spent 3 years constructing. Standing in the school parking lot with Victoria's hand in his and Sophie waiting just inside the building, Marcus allowed himself to consider what he'd been avoiding since their first lunch. That Victoria Hartford had become more than a boss or even a friend. She'd become someone he was beginning to trust with the parts of himself he'd kept carefully guarded. Sophie emerged from the building with Ms. Rodriguez, her expression brightening when she saw Marcus and Victoria standing together. She ran toward them with the unself-conscious enthusiasm of a child who'd gotten exactly the outcome she'd strategized for. "Did it work? Is Mrs. Wilson going to stop being mean?" Marcus released Victoria's hand reluctantly, turning his attention to his daughter. "It worked, but we're going to have a serious conversation later about manipulating situations and being honest about problems at school." Sophie had the grace to look somewhat abashed. "I know, but it worked though, right?" "It worked." Marcus couldn't quite keep the smile out of his voice. "Now thank Victoria properly for taking time out of her day." Sophie launched herself at Victoria with a hug that caught both adults off guard. "Thank you for helping my dad. People don't usually help him. They mostly just feel sorry or scared." Victoria's arms came around Sophie slowly, her expression shifting through emotions Marcus couldn't fully read with his limited vision. When she spoke, her voice carried a thickness that suggested tears. "Your dad doesn't need people to feel sorry for him. He needs people to see how capable and strong he is. I'm glad I get to be one of those people." Driving home later, Sophie chattered about the confrontation's outcome while Marcus processed the day's revelations. Victoria had defended him not as an employer accommodating a disabled employee, but as someone personally invested in his well-being. The distinction mattered more than he'd expected, shifting their relationship into territory that promised both connection and complication. That evening, after Sophie was asleep, Marcus sat in the quiet apartment and allowed himself to fully acknowledge what had been building since their first confrontation in the boardroom. Victoria Hartford had become important to him in ways that transcended professional gratitude. He was beginning to care for her, to trust her, to imagine a future that included more than just survival and Sophie's needs. The realization was terrifying because it made him vulnerable again, opened him to potential loss he'd sworn never to risk after Sarah's death. But underneath the fear was something else. Tentative hope that maybe, despite everything, he deserved more than just getting through each day. His phone buzzed with a text message. The screen reader converted Victoria's words to audio. "Thank you for letting me be part of today. I know accepting help isn't easy for you. For what it's worth, watching you advocate for Sophie while staying composed and dignified reminded me why I was right to trust my instincts about you. Sleep well, Marcus." He drafted and deleted 3 responses before settling on simple honesty. "You're becoming important to us, to me. That's new territory and it scares me, but I wanted you to know." Her response came quickly. "It scares me too. Let's figure it out together." Marcus set the phone aside and allowed himself to believe that maybe this time, figuring it out together was actually possible. Thursday morning brought the emergency board meeting Richard Montgomery had orchestrated with surgical precision. Marcus arrived at Apex headquarters an hour early, Victoria having briefed him the previous night on what to expect. The boardroom felt different than during his first day, the air heavier with anticipation, the chairs arranged in a configuration that positioned Richard at the head of the table with Victoria relegated to the side. Patricia Daniels distributed folders to each board member as they filed in, her expression carefully neutral but her movements efficient with purpose. Marcus took his designated seat near the back, aware that his presence was itself part of the evidence Richard intended to present. 10 board members settled into their positions, conversations dying as Richard called the meeting to order. "Thank you all for making time on short notice." Richard's voice carried the practiced authority of someone who'd spent decades in corporate leadership. "We're here to discuss organizational changes that have occurred over the past quarter. specifically 3 new executive-level positions created without full board consultation. He opened the folder before him, reading from prepared notes. These positions represent compensation packages exceeding industry standards by approximately 20% and were implemented during a fiscal period when we've been advising departmental budget constraints. Victoria's posture remained relaxed, but Marcus detected tension in the slight tightness of her shoulders. She waited for Richard to finish his preamble before responding, her voice carrying across the room with measured precision. The positions addressed documented operational inefficiencies that were costing the company significantly more than the new salaries represent. I'm happy to walk through the cost-benefit analysis. I'm sure the financial justification is compelling on paper. Richard's tone suggested he'd anticipated this response. However, my concern, and I believe the concern of several board members, extends beyond immediate fiscal metrics to questions of leadership judgment and professional boundaries. He nodded to Patricia, who activated the room's projection screen. Images appeared in succession. Marcus and Victoria at Rossetti's restaurant, captured through the window by someone with a telephoto lens. Victoria entering Bruno's Pizzeria where Marcus and Sophie waited. Victoria arriving at Lincoln Elementary, her hand on Marcus's arm as they spoke in the parking lot. These images document an unusual level of personal involvement between our CEO and a recently hired administrative assistant. Richard's voice remained carefully neutral, but the implication was clear. A pattern of private meetings, social engagements, and what appears to be integration into family activities. This raises legitimate questions about whether organizational decisions are being driven by business needs or personal factors. Marcus felt heat rising in his chest, the familiar anger at having his life reduced to evidence of impropriety. Several board members shifted uncomfortably, their gazes moving between the screen and Victoria's impassive face. Additionally, Richard continued, there are concerns about optics and cultural fit. Mr. Bennett's rapid advancement from entry-level administration to a position reporting directly to the CEO, combined with his particular circumstances. Victoria's interruption was sharp, controlled fury wrapped in professional language. Please clarify what you mean by that, Richard. Are you referring to Marcus's disability, his race, or some combination thereof? The directness of the challenge created immediate tension. Richard's jaw tightened visibly. I'm referring to the appearance of favoritism based on factors other than merit. The board has a fiduciary responsibility to ensure leadership decisions serve shareholder interests rather than personal preferences. Then let's discuss merit. Victoria opened her laptop, fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. Since Marcus joined Apex, interdepartmental communication failures have decreased 42%. Project documentation accuracy has improved 57%. He identified 3 critical integration issues in the Nexus project that our engineering team, fully cited I might add, had completely missed. These oversights would have cost the company approximately $2.3 million in deployment delays and patch development. She pulled up a spreadsheet, projecting it onto the screen where the surveillance photos had been. The positions I created, including Marcus's, generate measurable value that exceeds their cost by a factor of 5. If the board questions my judgment, it should be based on outcomes, not speculation about my personal life. Richard leaned back, his expression calculating. Victoria, no one questions your business acumen. However, the perception of impropriety can be as damaging as actual impropriety. A young CEO developing close personal relationships with employees, particularly employees who might be seen as vulnerable due to disability or other factors. It creates liability exposure and undermines confidence in leadership objectivity. The coded language was sophisticated, dancing around explicit accusations while making the subtext unmistakable. Marcus understood the strategy. Richard couldn't directly accuse Victoria of inappropriate conduct without evidence. So instead, he was constructing a narrative about judgment and perception that would force the board to question her authority. Marcus stood, the movement drawing immediate attention. His limited vision registered the shapes turning toward him, the sudden stillness that indicated he'd violated some unspoken protocol about when administrative staff could speak in board meetings. "If I may address the underlying concern directly." His voice carried clearly across the room, steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "The implication seems to be that Ms. Hartford's professional judgment regarding my position is compromised by personal factors. That assumption rests on several deeply problematic premises." Richard's voice held a note of condescension. "Mr. Bennett, this is a board-level discussion about organizational structure. Your input, while appreciated, isn't what? Relevant? Necessary?" Marcus didn't raise his voice, but his tone carried an edge that cut through Richard's dismissal. "I'm the evidence you're presenting for compromised judgment. That makes my perspective central to this discussion." Silence fell. Marcus sensed Victoria's tension, her desire to intervene warring with recognition that he needed to fight this battle himself. He continued before anyone could object. "Yes, Ms. Hartford and I have developed a professional relationship that extends to mutual respect on a personal level. This isn't unusual in effective business partnerships. Trust and understanding enhance communication rather than compromising it. But the suggestion that this relationship represents favoritism or poor judgment requires believing one of two things. Either that I'm not actually qualified for the position I hold, or that Ms. Hartford is incapable of separating personal feelings from business decisions." He pulled out his tablet, activating the screen reader so that data appeared both visually for the board and audibly for himself. "The first premise is objectively false, as demonstrated by the performance metrics Ms. Hartford just presented. The second premise is insulting to a CEO who has consistently demonstrated exceptional leadership and strategic thinking. So perhaps we should examine the actual concern here, that some people are uncomfortable with a black man who is visually impaired receiving recognition and opportunity based on merit rather than charity." The words hung in the air like a detonation. Several board members shifted uncomfortably, but Marcus wasn't finished. "My skin color and my disability don't define my worth. My work does. If anyone in this room questions whether I earned consideration for advancement based on documented performance, that reveals their biases, not Ms. Hartford's judgment." Richard's face had gone pale, then flushed an angry red. "That's an inappropriate and inflammatory accusation, Mr. Bennett. No one here harbors discriminatory attitudes. We're simply concerned about what exactly?" The new voice came from the far end of the table, where an older black woman had been sitting quietly throughout the meeting. Dr. Grace Mitchell, according to the nameplate before her, carried herself with the authority of someone who'd navigated boardrooms for decades. "Because from where I'm sitting, this entire discussion sounds remarkably familiar. The same concerns about optics and perception and cultural fit that were raised 30 years ago when I was appointed to my first executive position." She stood, her gaze moving around the table with pointed significance. "Richard, you opposed my appointment too, if memory serves. Something about my qualifications being adequate but not exceptional, and concerns about whether the company was making decisions based on merit or diversity quotas." Her voice carried steel beneath its measured tone. "You were wrong then, and you're wrong now." Richard sputtered, his composure cracking. "Grace, this isn't comparable. We're discussing organizational process, we're discussing whether this board trusts our CEO's judgment, or whether we're going to undermine her authority based on discomfort with her personal choices." Dr. Mitchell turned to face Victoria directly. "I've reviewed the documentation you circulated about these new positions. The business case is sound. The performance outcomes exceed projections. And frankly, if we're going to question every leadership decision where personal relationships exist, we'd need to investigate half the C-suite appointments in corporate America." She let that observation settle before continuing. Mr. Bennett makes an excellent point about merit versus perception. His work speaks for itself. If someone wants to argue he doesn't deserve the position, they should present evidence of inadequate performance. Otherwise, this is exactly what he suggested: discomfort with competence that doesn't match our preconceived assumptions. The shift in energy was palpable. Several board members who'd been nodding along with Richard's concerns now looked uncertain, caught between his established authority and Dr. Mitchell's moral clarity. Patricia Daniels, who'd been sitting silently since distributing the folders, cleared her throat. If I may offer HR's perspective, we conducted a standard accommodation review with Mr. Bennett and found no issues with his workplace integration or performance. The concerns that were raised have been largely anecdotal, based on observations of off-hours social interactions that don't violate any company policies. The carefully neutral statement was nevertheless damaging to Richard's position. Marcus realized that Patricia, despite her earlier skepticism, wasn't willing to stake her professional credibility on Richard's vendetta. Richard recognized his momentum slipping. He shifted tactics, his voice taking on a tone of paternal concern. I appreciate the passionate defenses, but let's not lose sight of corporate governance principles. When a CEO develops close personal relationships with direct reports, it creates conflicts of interest regardless of the individual's qualifications. The prudent action would be to restructure Mr. Bennett's reporting line so it doesn't flow directly through Victoria. That would undermine the entire purpose of his position. Victoria's response was immediate. Technical documentation specialist requires direct access to executive decision-making to be effective. Filtering through intermediate management defeats the purpose. Then perhaps the position itself should be reconsidered. Richard's suggestion was delivered with false reasonableness. We could contract this work to an outside firm, eliminating any concerns about internal reporting relationships. The proposal would effectively terminate Marcus while maintaining a veneer of organizational optimization. Marcus felt Victoria's fury radiating across the room, but before she could respond, Dr. Mitchell spoke again. I move that we vote on the following resolution. The board affirms Victoria Hartford's authority to structure her executive team as she deems appropriate for operational effectiveness, and recognizes the positions created in the past quarter as serving legitimate business needs supported by documented performance outcomes. The motion was procedurally aggressive, forcing the board to either support Victoria's authority explicitly or vote against it and reveal their opposition. Richard objected immediately. That's premature. We haven't fully discussed the governance implications. We've discussed them thoroughly. Dr. Mitchell's voice was firm. Richard has presented concerns about perception and relationships. Victoria has presented objective performance data. It's time to decide whether we trust our CEO's judgment or whether we're going to micromanage her organizational decisions based on personal discomfort. Another board member, a woman in her 50s Marcus hadn't heard speak before, raised her hand. I second Dr. Mitchell's motion. We hired Victoria because of her strategic thinking and leadership capability. If we're going to question every decision that makes us uncomfortable, we undermine the authority we gave her. The vote proceeded with tense formality. 10 hands rose in favor of the resolution. Only Richard and one other board member abstained, their opposition noted in the minutes but overwhelmed by majority support. Marcus felt the tension in his shoulders begin to release, though he knew this victory was temporary. Richard Montgomery didn't accept defeat gracefully. As the meeting adjourned, board members filed out with various levels of discomfort evident in their body language. Dr. Mitchell approached Marcus directly, her voice warm despite the formal setting. That took courage, young man. Speaking truth to power never gets easier, but it's always necessary. Thank you for your support. Marcus extended his hand, which she shook firmly. I wasn't sure anyone would back me up. I know exactly what you're facing because I lived it 30 years ago. Different specifics, Same fundamental prejudice wrapped in professional concern. She released his hand but didn't step back. The difference is you have Victoria in your corner from the start. I had to fight those battles alone. Don't take that alliance for granted. After she left, Marcus stood in the empty boardroom processing what had just occurred. The victory felt significant but fragile, bought at the cost of making his relationship with Victoria a matter of official board record. Any future development between them would now carry heightened scrutiny, their personal choices subject to corporate evaluation. Victoria's voice came from the doorway, soft and uncertain in a way he'd never heard before. You defended me. You've been defending me since the moment we met. Marcus turned toward her voice. Seemed only fair to return the favor. What you said about merit and bias, that took real courage. Most people would have let me fight that battle alone. Most people haven't had their competence questioned in every job interview for 3 years. Marcus moved toward her, his cane tracing the familiar path to the door. I know how to recognize discrimination even when it's dressed up in concerns about process and perception. They stood close enough that Marcus could sense Victoria's trembling, the emotional aftermath of the confrontation catching up to her now that the performance was over. Without planning it, he reached for her hand, finding it and squeezing gently. We won today. That's what matters. Richard won't let this go. He'll keep looking for leverage, keep pushing until he finds something he can use to undermine my authority. Victoria's voice carried exhaustion beneath the words. And you're the most visible target. Then we make sure my work remains beyond reproach. We document everything, maintain clear professional boundaries at the office, and refuse to give him ammunition. Marcus paused, considering the implications. Which means we need to define what we're doing here. The relationship that Richard's so concerned about. What is it exactly? The question hung between them, forcing acknowledgement of what they'd been carefully avoiding. Victoria's hand tightened around his, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. I don't know, but it's becoming the most important thing in my life, and that terrifies me. The admission cut through Marcus's remaining defenses. He pulled her closer, her forehead coming to rest against his shoulder as tension finally broke into something softer. They stood like that for a long moment, two people who'd spent years building walls around vulnerability, allowing themselves to be seen. It terrifies me too. Marcus's voice was rough with emotion he'd suppressed since Sarah's death. I've been alone so long that I forgot what it feels like to let someone in. But you're already inside, Victoria. You and Sophie have become my whole world, and I'm scared of what happens if I lose you. You won't lose me. Victoria's certainty was absolute despite the fear underlying it. We figure this out together. Slowly, carefully, with Sophie's well-being as our priority, but we figure it out. The simple declaration felt like a promise neither of them was quite ready to articulate fully, but which hung between them with binding force. They separated reluctantly, both aware that remaining in the empty boardroom invited exactly the kind of speculation they needed to avoid. Walking to the elevator, Marcus felt the weight of the morning settling into bone-deep exhaustion. The confrontation with Richard had required every ounce of composure he'd developed over 3 years of navigating a world designed for sighted people. But underneath the fatigue was something else. A sense of having finally claimed space for himself rather than simply accepting whatever scraps of opportunity others deigned to offer. The months that followed brought careful navigation of boundaries, both professional and personal. Marcus threw himself into his work with intensity that produced results even his harshest critics couldn't dismiss. His technical assessments became required reading for executive decisions, his documentation setting new standards for clarity and comprehensiveness. Victoria maintained professional distance at the office while their personal connection deepened during carefully orchestrated time outside work hours. Sophie adapted to Victoria's increasing presence in their lives with enthusiasm tempered by occasional uncertainty. She'd started calling Victoria Vic sometime around April, the casual nickname signaling acceptance that went beyond formal friendliness. But there were moments when Marcus caught Sophie watching them with an expression too complex for a child her age. Happiness mixed with something that looked like fear of losing what she'd just found. The science fair loomed on the calendar. September 15th circled in red marker on the kitchen calendar Sophie maintained with meticulous care. Her Jupiter model had evolved significantly from its initial conception, incorporating features that demonstrated both her visual creativity and Marcus's tactile problem-solving. They worked on it together during evenings, Victoria often joining them to offer suggestions that bridged both perspectives. One evening in late August, Victoria arrived with pizza and found Marcus and Sophie arguing over the model's orbital mechanics display. Sophie insisted the planets should rotate at speeds proportional to their actual orbital periods. Marcus pointed out this would make the inner planets spin so fast they'd be invisible while the outer ones barely moved. "You're both right, which means you're both wrong." Victoria's observation made them both stop mid-argument. The goal isn't perfect accuracy, it's educational clarity. What if you use two different modes, one that shows accurate relative speeds and another that normalizes them so viewers can actually see all the movement? Sophie's eyes widened. "That's brilliant. We could have a switch that changes between modes and explain why both representations are useful." The solution was elegant, addressing both their concerns while adding educational depth. Marcus listened to Sophie and Victoria excitedly planning the implementation, feeling a contentment he'd thought impossible after Sarah's death. This was what family felt like, not replacing what he'd lost, but building something new that honored the past while embracing the future. September 15th arrived with Sophie vibrating with barely controlled nerves. She'd rehearsed her presentation countless times, but the prospect of performing in front of judges and peers elevated the stakes to terrifying heights. Marcus dressed carefully in his best suit, aware that he'd be as much on display as Sophie, visible evidence that disabled parents could support their children's achievements. The district science fair occupied the high school gymnasium, rows of tables displaying projects ranging from volcano models to elaborate robotics demonstrations. Sophie's Jupiter exhibit was positioned in the innovation category, surrounded by projects that looked significantly more complex. Marcus felt her confidence wavering as they set up. "Dad, what if the judges think it's too simple? Look at that autonomous drone project next to us." The judges are evaluating educational value and creativity, not just technical complexity. Marcus helped her position the audio components while she arranged the visual elements. "We created something that teaches everyone, not just people who learn one specific way. That's innovative." Victoria arrived as they were finishing setup, her presence drawing curious looks from other parents who recognized her from business news coverage. She'd brought flowers for Sophie and a thermos of coffee for Marcus, small gestures that spoke of attention to detail and care. The presentation began at 10:30, three judges circulating through the innovation category with clipboards and evaluative expressions. When they reached Sophie's table, she launched into her explanation with initial nervousness that gradually transformed into confident enthusiasm. "Our multi-sensory solar system model demonstrates how different learning styles can be integrated into a single educational tool." Sophie gestured to the visual components first, accurately scaled planets with detailed surface textures and colors. For visual learners, the model provides astronomically correct representations, including Jupiter's Great Red Spot and atmospheric banding. She moved to the tactile elements, guiding one judge's hand to feel the textured surfaces Marcus had created. For tactile learners, each planet has unique textures representing surface features. Jupiter's bands are raised ridges. The red spot is a distinctive spiral pattern. Users can explore through touch and develop understanding without relying on sight. Marcus stepped forward for the audio component demonstration, activating the QR codes Sophie had integrated around the base. Each planet has associated audio content providing scientific data, atmospheric composition, and orbital characteristics. This makes the model accessible to learners who process information best through sound, including visually impaired students like myself. One judge, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a thoughtful expression, leaned closer. "This is fascinating. How did you divide the work between you?" Sophie answered without hesitation. "We didn't divide it. We combined our strengths. I handle visual accuracy because I can see details Dad can't. He creates tactile elements because his touch sensitivity is more developed than mine. Together we see everything, just through different senses." The judge made a note on her clipboard, her expression unreadable. They moved on to the next project, leaving Marcus and Sophie in anxious uncertainty about their performance. The morning stretched into afternoon as judges completed their evaluations. Sophie fidgeted nervously, comparing their model to increasingly elaborate projects. Victoria kept her distracted with questions about the research process, drawing out stories about late-night disagreements over planetary ring accuracy and the weekend they'd spent testing different textures to represent Saturn's atmosphere. At 2 o'clock, the head judge announced the innovation category winner. Sophie gripped Marcus's hand so tightly his fingers went numb. The judge's voice carried across the gymnasium. "First place in innovation goes to Sophia Bennett and Marcus Bennett for their multi-sensory solar system model." The judges were particularly impressed by the integration of different learning modalities into a single cohesive educational tool, and by the project's demonstration that collaboration across different abilities produces outcomes superior to what either contributor could achieve alone. Sophie's shriek of joy nearly deafened Marcus. She launched herself at him with a hug that knocked him back a step, then pulled Victoria into their embrace with unself-conscious enthusiasm. They collected the award together, Sophie holding the certificate while Marcus accepted the ribbon, both of them grinning with uncomplicated happiness. After the ceremony, as they packed up the model, Victoria pulled Marcus aside while Sophie was distracted by congratulations from Ms. Rodriguez. Her voice carried nervous excitement. "I have a proposal about the model and what comes next." "I'm listening." "Apex has been looking for educational outreach opportunities that align with our accessibility initiatives. What if we develop this into a full curriculum? Multi-sensory models for entire scientific disciplines, partnered with schools to train teachers on inclusive education methods." Victoria spoke quickly, enthusiasm building. "Sophie and you could be ambassadors for the program, showing that disability isn't a barrier to achievement, it's just a different path to the same destination." The opportunity was significant, offering Sophie recognition and purpose while advancing causes Marcus had championed since his accident. But it also meant deeper entanglement of their personal and professional lives, making their relationship even more visible and potentially vulnerable to the Richard Montgomerys of the world. As if reading his hesitation, Victoria added, "I know it blurs lines we've been trying to maintain, but maybe those lines were artificial to begin with. Our lives are already intertwined. This just makes the integration purposeful and productive." Marcus considered her words, weighing risks against potential impact. Finally, he nodded. "Let's do it. But we do it right. Formal partnership agreements, clear metrics, everything documented and transparent, so no one can question the legitimacy." "Agreed. And Marcus," Victoria's voice dropped to something more private, "there's something else I've been wanting to discuss about us and where this is heading." Before she could continue, Sophie returned with the certificate clutched triumphantly. "Vic, did you see? First place. We actually won." "I saw, sweetheart. You and your dad were incredible up there." Victoria's professional mask slipped back into place, but her eyes held a promise of conversation to be continued later. They celebrated with ice cream at Sophie's favorite shop. The three of them crowded into a corner booth with a massive sundae Sophie insisted they needed to rate scientifically. The normalcy of it, the teasing arguments over flavor rankings, the laughter over melting ice cream, the casual touches between Victoria and Marcus that had become natural over months, felt like glimpses of a future Marcus had stopped believing possible. That evening, after Sophie had fallen asleep clutching her certificate, Marcus sat with Victoria on the apartment's small balcony. The September air carried the first hints of autumn, cool enough to justify sitting close together for warmth. "What did you want to talk about earlier?" Marcus broke the comfortable silence, before Sophie interrupted. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, her breathing the only sound besides distant traffic. When she spoke, her voice carried vulnerability Marcus had learned to recognize as her truest self. "I want to be part of this. Not just the outreach program or the professional collaboration, but your life. Yours and Sophie's. Permanently." The declaration should have terrified him. Commitment after only 6 months, promises when his last relationship had ended in devastating loss. But instead, Marcus felt a certainty that settled into his bones like coming home. "I want that too. But I need to know you understand what you're signing up for." He turned toward her, his limited vision registering her outline against the city lights. "Loving someone who's disabled means navigating a world that sees us as less than whole. It means defending our legitimacy constantly, fighting assumptions, accepting that some people will always question your choices." "I've been doing that since we met." Victoria's hand found his in the darkness. "Richard, Patricia, everyone who thinks they know better, they don't matter. What matters is that I've never felt more myself than when I'm with you and Sophie. You see me, Marcus. Not the CEO, not the Hartford family legacy, just me. That's rarer than you know. Sophie needs to be part of this conversation. She's invested in you now, and if things don't work out, they'll work out." Victoria's certainty cut through his fear. "I'm not Sarah, and I can't replace her. But I can be what Sophie needs going forward. Someone who's here, who's committed, who sees both of you as complete exactly as you are." Marcus pulled her closer, feeling the rightness of her presence against his side. "Then we do this properly. We date intentionally, we introduce you as part of Sophie's life gradually, we build something solid before making it permanent." "How long is gradually?" Victoria's question carried amusement beneath the genuine inquiry. "I don't know. Long enough for Sophie to adjust, for us to be certain." Marcus hesitated, then added what he'd been holding back. "Sarah made me promise to keep seeing with my heart. I think she meant this. Being open to love, even when it's terrifying. Trusting that not everyone leaves." "I'm not leaving." Victoria's whisper was fierce with conviction. "You're stuck with me, Marcus Bennett. Both of you." They sat in comfortable silence as the city hummed around them. Two people who'd found each other through confrontation and stayed through choice. Marcus thought about the journey from that first boardroom meeting. Victoria's accusation, his calm response, the unexpected recognition that had sparked between them. He'd walked into Apex Technologies seeking survival and found something infinitely more valuable. Partnership built on mutual respect, attraction grounded in genuine understanding, and love that saw wholeness where others perceived lack. The future stretched uncertain but no longer terrifying. There would be more Richards, more Karens, more people who questioned their legitimacy or assumed dysfunction where none existed. But they'd face those challenges together, their different perspectives creating something stronger than either could build alone. Sophie's voice drifted from her bedroom window. "Are you guys done talking about feelings? Because I'm trying to sleep and Vic keeps giggling." Marcus laughed, the sound free from the restraint that had characterized so much of his life since the accident. "Sorry, sweetheart. We'll keep it down." "It's okay. I'm happy you're happy." Sophie's voice was already thick with sleep. Just maybe save the mushy stuff for when I'm not listening. Victoria buried her face against Marcus's shoulder to muffle her laughter. When she'd composed herself, she lifted her head and spoke toward the window. Deal. Now go to sleep before your dad makes you explain the difference between tactile and kinetic learning for the 100th time. That was one time. Sophie's protest carried mock indignation. And I was right about the distinction. You were absolutely right. Now sleep. The window closed with an emphatic thump. Marcus and Victoria sat together under the stars, content in the knowledge that they'd built something real from the most unlikely beginning. Different didn't mean broken. It just meant finding new ways to see, new paths to connection, new definitions of complete. Somewhere above them, Jupiter hung bright in the September sky, its massive presence visible even to Marcus's damaged eyes. He thought about that first science fair planning session, Sophie explaining her vision while he contributed tactile solutions, both of them creating something neither could have achieved alone. That same principle had guided everything since. Different perspectives combining into wholeness, limitations transforming into strengths when paired with understanding. Victoria's hand tightened around his. What are you thinking about? Jupiter. Sophie's model. How she taught us that seeing differently doesn't mean seeing less, just seeing more completely when you combine viewpoints. That's actually profound. Victoria's voice held genuine admiration. We should use that for the educational program tagline. Absolutely not. Sophie would never let us hear the end of claiming her insights as our own. Their laughter mingled with the city sounds, two people who'd found their way to each other through honesty about limitations and celebration of capabilities. The path ahead remained complex, filled with challenges both personal and professional. But for the first time since Sarah's death, Marcus believed that complexity could be navigated successfully, not despite his disability, but incorporating it as one element of a life lived fully and completely. The future was unwritten, uncertain, and absolutely worth pursuing together.